So, it would appear dinosaurs are relevant again. You know what that means.
Boom, boom, acca-lacca-lacca, boom, 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 acca-lacca, boom.
I think I might just have blown up the internet. You're welcome, by the way. If you were a child growing up in the 90s, chances are you've been figuratively stampeded on by the collective dinosaur mania that overtook popular culture somewhere in between The Land Before Time, Jurassic Park, and Extreme Dinosaurs. Yes, that needed to be mentioned, apparently. There was never a moment in mediatic history in which those lovely extinct feathery reptiles, thanks a lot science, happened to be a big part of our imagination as they were in that particular period of time. The dino craze expanded over television, music, video games, merchandise, Weird Al's claymation world, and so on. As for cinema, it's actually a much longer story. Those prehistoric prancers had been part of the now extinct celluloid film since time immemoria, which is to say, the very beginning of the medium itself. 1925's The Lost World presented a then impressive slew of stop-motion animated dinosaurs, as well as 1933's King Kong. Special effects genius Ray Harryhausen built his entire career out of animating clay monsters, most of which were in fact dinosaurs. And again, there's Fantasia, The Beast from a 20,000 Fathoms, Gojira! Daffy Duck and the Dinosaur. I could go on forever. Instead, I'll get to the point now. Ideally, this was all possible thanks to a film made all the way back in 1914. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Gertie. Yes, her name is Gertie. Presenting Winsor McCay, America's greatest cartoonist, according to himself, a prolific artist most notably remembered for his Little Nemo comic strip, detailing the escapades of a child in the world of Slumberland, which he could only access through his dreams, thus leaving into ambiguity whether it was literally another world or the product of his subconscious wonders and fears. This was one of those fundamental milestones in modern storytelling, whose influence is so deeply ingrained in our collective mindset that it keeps popping out in the most unsuspecting places, partly because McKay's creation is the forefather of the whole fantasy coming-of-age genre, but mostly because I really wanted an excuse to reference one of my most favorite games of all time. Oh yes, I am totally eluding the idea that Klonoa is a modern-day equivalent of Nemo. He is called the Dream Traveler after all, which also gave the name to my old video game show. Self-promotion. Back to topic, McCay was already a big name in the then flourishing funny papers industry with his most famous creation. But that wasn't enough now, was it? He wanted more! He wanted to bring his work to life! And so he did. Albeit not the first artist to ever experiment with the medium of animation, Winsor is pretty much the reason why cartoons eventually became animated cartoons, aka what we commonly refer to as cartoons nowadays. Gertie the Dinosaur was arguably the first animated cartoon to focus on a specific character from which to build a story around. I say arguably, in quotation marks, because, sadly, the vast majority of films made in the early 20th century are irremediably lost due to the lack of a proper archive or a means of preservation that, logically speaking, could not have existed back then. Therefore, when I stated that Gertie the Dinosaur was arguably the first animation of its kind, I really meant to say it was the first of its kind that we know of. Speaking of first times, this film wasn't even fully a cartoon. It alternated between live-action footage of Winsor McCay and his real-life cartoonist friends eating at a restaurant, and the dinosaur herself timidly coming to life in the panels set by McCay in said restaurant. So yes, this film was arguably also the first one to mix live action with traditional animation, paving the way for such pillars of the medium such as the Fleischer Brothers, which would actually include cartoons inside live action scenes, Disney and iWorks' earliest work, the Alice comedies, which brought a real person inside the cartoon, and of course everything else you know and love that was made with this mixed technique. The premise is as follows. Winsor McCay bets his friend and fellow cartoonist George McManus a dinner for the whole party that he can make the dinosaurus live again by a series of hand-drawn cartoons. Hence the reason this is taking place in a fancy restaurant. The rest of the film showcases said animated dinosaurus, a brontosaurus to be specific, or a brachiosaurus, or however scientists want to call it, following her master's every command like a circus act. An analogy that fits rather well with the wow factor of the medium at the time. Before it became an established art form or an industry, cinema was much like the circus, in that its novelty was used to impress people. You could say that in a very subtle metatextual way. Gertie the Dinosaur was a self-aware novelty show within the novelty show that was cinema. At the end of the demonstration, McCay inserts himself in Gertie's own world to put an exclamation point to his entire act. Afterwards, George McManus paid up the party's dinner, and that's that. There are two known versions of this short film, both easy to find online. A 5 minutes long one that only covers the dinner demonstration sequence that I just described, and a longer one about 14 minutes in length. This version provides an expanded backstory for the bet between McCay and McManus, which was inspired by a trip to the Museum of Natural History, as well as an interesting behind-the-scenes sequence showcasing the sheer amount of work that it took to animate Gertie. We are talking about 10,000 hand-drawn frames on sheets made of rice paper. I want you to think about that for a moment, because that's how you made cartoons back then. Needless to say, I recommend to watch this version since it tells the complete story. Now, here's a little piece of information that will blow your mind. The live-action segments of this film were added after the animated portion. That's because the act you saw McCay perform in front of his friends was the same act he used to perform in front of an actual live audience. That's right, Gertie the Dinosaur was a real-life circus act. A vaudeville act to be precise, but you get the idea. He would order his creature to do certain tricks, and the animated dinosaur on the big screen would do as it was commanded. Obviously, it was the same set of orders every time, because she was not really there, but nonetheless, this was an impressive feat for the time. So yes, I can believe he's America's greatest cartoonist. Not only was he a central figure in the upbringing of the then young animation medium, but he's pretty much the reason why audiences fell in love with dinosaurs to begin with. In fact, come to think of it, this man was an eccentric, wealthy person obsessed with prehistoric monsters that succeeded in bringing them back to life through his own means in order to wow people. Winsor McCay was the original John Hammond. Oops, I broke the internet. Again.